You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
I'm here today on September 1st with Christopher Coyne. He is the professor of economics and the A. Baldy Harper Chair of Political Economy at George Mason. And he's also the Director of Graduate Studies for the PhD program here at George Mason University. And Chris, as you know, the context of this is for my economic sociology class. And in the book that they're first reading in the economic sociology class, it's by a man named Richard Swedberg, which I think you might have even read this. And he basically defines economic sociology as economic activity that's embedded inside of legal, political, and social structures, and that our job is to study how these structures impact economic performance, but also to examine the internal logic of these structures as well. And for this, our conversation, you're the perfect person in many ways to discuss these issues because you've written a series of books using the tools of economics to assess US-led efforts to construct democracy and markets abroad and also attempt to deliver humanitarian aid. And I wanted to ask you to describe how you got started in that area of research and what's the most important lessons that you've learned in your studies.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me to talk. It's great. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And it's a great class that you're teaching. And so hopefully this is somewhat helpful. And so in terms of how I got into this stuff, really it was, serendipity in terms of topic, but, I had the background, of course, the students in your class may or may not know, you taught me undergraduate, and you're the one that introduced me to both Austrian economics and public choice or Virginia political economy. And so for the year I had you as a undergraduate at Manhattan College, my junior year, I was fortunate enough to have you for comparative economic systems. And so there it was all, Mises, Hayek, calculation type discussions, Lavoie, and economic development and transition issues. And then in public economics, we actually used Joseph Stiglitz's book as our textbook. But of course, you also introduced us to public choice. So again, I didn't know any of this by this terminology at the time, but the ideas, and that's what got me into all this. And so you and I kept in touch after you left to move from Manhattan College to GMU, and then I graduated after another year and worked for 2 years. And so when I decided to get a PhD, I knew I wanted to be at GMU. It's the only school I applied to. I wanted to work with you, and I knew that I wanted to pursue research in the areas of Austrian economics and Virginia political economy. And so in the interim, I had been reading a lot of this stuff on my own. Again, I didn't internalize much of it, but I had been trying to. And so I get to GMU, and really our second, I guess it was our second or third week of classes, the 9/11 attacks happened. And of course, the main target is New York City. The World Trade Center is, of course, a place near and dear to your heart and to mine, having grown up in the area and lived in the area. But then you have the Pentagon as well, not far from where we're located in Fairfax. And so that all happens. And then soon thereafter, the United States government invades Afghanistan and Iraq and undertakes what is the still ongoing, what's called the War on Terror. And so that was the context for all this. That's all what's happening. And I happened to be assigned to Tyler Cowen as his research assistant for my fellowship. They were called Buchanan Fellowships then. We didn't have the Hayek fellowships. And I remember just being in Tyler's office one day it must have been September, October, and we were just chatting. And I was just saying, no one seems to be talking about what to us as economists, and certainly those of us in the Virginia political economy tradition would focus on. Things like, incentives, but not just incentives, for some given problem that needs to be solved, but very context-specific incentives. So incentives within the United States government, then unpack all the different layers of that. And then incentives in facing the people in Afghanistan and Iraq, and not just the citizens, but all the different groups in those societies, and then the government, and then regional actors, and so on down the line. And then even more importantly, you have epistemic issues or knowledge issues, and very few people were asking the question, do people in the United States government, whoever those decision makers are, which again is a complex, multi-layered group of people, but do they have the knowledge to actually design a society in Afghanistan or in Iraq or so on, which was the claim. The claim was we're going to nation build, really rebuild a society, both in development terms, but also liberal democratic institutions. In any case, long story short, that turned into my dissertation. And so really it was a straightforward application of those concepts to a complex topic. Yeah. And so really the topic was, as I said, it was serendipity that it happened, an unfortunate event with 9/11. And then, my dissertation consisted of papers, but another point of serendipity was my last year in graduate school, I was sitting outside your office in a cube. There used to be cubes outside in our old building. And a editor from Stanford University Press actually came to see you. She was going around to meet with the faculty. I forget what happened. I don't know if you got a call. You blew her off somehow. And you said, go talk to Chris. And I was sitting outside in the cube. I had no clue.
I didn't blow her off. I just told her to go talk to you.
Well, I don't know. In any case, I'm glad you did. Whatever you did, thank you. Because she came and talked to me. And, I told her about my dissertation. Again, the idea of writing a book, GMU is a very book-friendly culture. So all my professors were writing books. And so that wasn't odd to me. But the idea of writing a book was a very grandiose and intimidating thing. And so anyway, we talked and she said, well, you should write a book proposal. Of course, I had no idea what a book proposal was, but I did it, what I thought it was. And I actually ended up getting a book contract, almost leaving GMU. It was between leaving GMU and starting my first job, writing it with a book contract, which is pretty amazing in hindsight and awesome. Fortunate. Yeah. And I remember, I called you probably the fall semester of my right after I left. And I remember saying to you, I'm very overwhelmed by this, because it is overwhelming when you say write hundreds of pages as a book. And I remember you saying to me, it's still a lesson I remember to this day. And I think it's a wonderful way to frame any overwhelming project. And you said to me, look, you've written lots of papers, so why not think of a book somewhere from 6 to 7 to 8 papers around a theme? And if you think about it that way, it kind of makes it into chunks that are much more digestible as compared to saying write 300 or 400 pages. Book, and, that's always how I've thought about it. In any case, that was the kind of the impetus behind the first book. In terms of things I've learned, I've learned a lot in terms of how to do academics, based on that experience. So there was that really set me up for everything I've done since and hopefully improved upon. But intellectually, I think the main things I've kind of learned are the power of, again, what you and I and many other people in our kind of world, perhaps many people in your class, kind of take for granted. Around GMU, if you say economic calculation, they'll say, okay, we heard that in, Professor Wagner's class. We heard in Professor Boettke's class. We heard in Professor Leeson's class. We heard it in my class, if you took my class. It's like, all right, we got to understand that it's, first of all, a very nuanced argument. So it's not just like something we just say as a stopping argument. And second of all, to those outside of our sphere, if you will, that argument is one that's not fully understood. And this, I think, is where there's an entry point for people interested in economics and sociology. Because as you pointed out, if we want to study purposive human actors embedded in a variety of different contexts and structures, well, then we need to appreciate the uniqueness of the knowledge problem. And that knowledge problem applies at different levels. One is the way we typically think about it. Governments can't allocate resources, or central planners, I should say, absent property rights and prices, can't allocate resources to their highest valued use. But there's another layer to that, which is the outsider who has, you can think about it, not so much physical distance, but knowledge distance, doesn't have the local context-specific knowledge that people possess about the different kind of relationships they have, the different types of norms and traditions, and things that allow them to engage in cooperative behavior with other people, to resolve collective action problems and so on. And so what you get is when outsiders come in and try to jam things on top of people, whether it is kind of meta overarching institutions or development. I'm going to plan how to create wealth. What happens is that there's a disconnect between those things oftentimes, and then you have a choice. You either kind of back off or you jam it in. And in order to jam it in, you have to raise the cost of defection, which leads to very illiberal outcomes very, very quickly.
We'll come back to that in a second. I wanted to react to two things there. I think it's important to remember that economic development became part of the Bush II administration's national security policy after 9/11. So the idea is that if you could make a country become wealthy, then the people would be less likely to engage in the kind of aggressive activity towards others. And so development became part, but it was an effort to orchestrate development again. So it's kind of interesting. It wasn't an effort to have organic development happen through trade and entrepreneurship. It was about how do I, as a state, orchestrate development, and then orchestrating it will then lead to entrepreneurship. So it's kind of interesting.
And it's even worse than that because, or more complex, because it was that, but the other thing you get is the rise of what people in the business call the 3Ds, right? You get defense, development, and diplomacy. Diplomacy got marginalized. Development kind of got pushed down to the middle of the three, and defense took the realm. And what's defense? Well, by defense, they mean military. And it's not defending against things, it's proactive military action to defend against future threats. So we're never going to let this happen again. One of the ways you do that is to create development. So then you really militarize the development enterprise. And so you had all those issues you were just saying, but it's really then at the point of a gun, which makes it even more problematic, but troublesome as well on a variety of margins, economic, ethical, and others.
Yeah. There's one other thing associated with that I'll mention, which is, and maybe you can say a quick word about this, but the effort to try to be interdisciplinary led to the idea of the Human Terrain Project, where they could actually invoke using anthropologists and whatnot to go there to interview the people about what they wanted in development. Like, do you want a school? Do you want that? But because it was hostile territories, they were guided by US military with guns, to do a survey of someone in their house. So do you really want a public school here for us? Like that. And so this whole process of that democracy and development we're now going to emerge, but at the point of a gun, is really something that was an amazing catastrophe in so many ways.
Yeah. Bill Easterly has this wonderful review of Paul Collier's book. It's not The Bottom Billion, it's the follow-up one. It's like Democracy, Votes, and Guns, or something like that. It's called. I forget but I always remember this last line. He takes Collier to task for data mining. And he says, this is a perfect example of if you just look at what he's doing, where he's shifting radically between books on major policy issues, because you're just grabbing whatever, throwing in it's the kitchen sink approach. In any case, Easterly has this great line at the end of that review where he says, economists shouldn't play with statistics, let alone with guns. And I love the line, but I also think it's a very important line to keep in mind, which is, and this is really one of Hayek's warnings with the pretense of knowledge, as well as his other writings, is that you can't treat the world like a chessboard, right? To invoke Adam Smith, you can't measure stuff, aggregate up, find simple relationships, and this impose your vision upon the world by shifting levers. There's human beings here. And it's not just that you lose their purposes and plans. I'm not trying to, pull at heartstrings by saying there's real human beings involved. It's that you're giving one group of people guns, and then you are attempting to use scientific expertise to use those guns to impose a vision upon other human beings in the name of liberalism, by the way. And so, Don Lavoie's book, National Economic Planning, at the end of it, among others, he takes to tasks conservatives. And he says, look, one of the problems with conservatives, they use the rhetoric of liberalism, but they rely on the force of government in the name of that. And those things are at odds. You're going to undermine the very things you want to do. And that's something I've always taken to heart. Because it's if you truly believe in a liberal society, which again is the claim of the people intervening, irrespective of what I think or what other analysts think, can you achieve liberal ends using illiberal means? That's an important question. That's something that I think economics and economic sociology can shed light on.
Yeah, before I go to my next question, I don't want to derail the conversation, because I think this is exactly on this point that I want to drill down on. But when you were talking, you mentioned about your first semester in graduate school, it really reminded me of the difficulties that your class that entered at 2001 had to confront. Boom, 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 boom. Because one of them was not only 9/11, but then also we had, the other plane out in Long Island got shot down soon after. We also had the shooter, in the Washington D.C. area, where and remember that shooter took out a family in the Home Depot not too far away from the campus, actually, right down, and so all that stuff was going on at that time. And, you guys are in class and we're like, okay, midterm coming up, midterm and everything. And I don't think we missed a single seminar, during the time. It's when I think back on it, it's bizarre. I think we maybe didn't go to school the rest of the week of 9/11, but then after that we were back at school the following Monday, I think. Yep.
They canceled a couple days of classes, and then it was back to normal. It was very quick. It was very jarring. I mean, the whole country, of course, was jarring, but in the areas where it happened, it was jarring, extremely jarring. But yeah, it was a different world then.
Yeah, I was teaching when the attacks happened. You've heard this story 5 million times, and I'm sure I'm embellishing some. But what happened was one of the students in the class had a cell phone, and she got a call to say that there was, one plane, and then she got a call to say there's another plane. So I turned to Pete, who was my TA, and I said, could you go upstairs and find out what the hell's going on? And I had given the class a quiz when they entered into the class. That was the standard practice at that time for me. And Pete comes back down. He's like, white as a sheet, and he turns to me and he says, the trade centers have been destroyed. The Pentagon has been destroyed, and there's an attack on Congress. That's actually what, his report was. And he says this in front of this class, like 100 and something students or whatever. And so I look out on the class, I'm in shock, and I like, okay, so we're going to cut class short. So you can go and take care of your loved ones or whatever I said. And then they got up and they started listening. I said, don't forget to turn in your quizzes. So I had to collect their quizzes on the way out. Anyway, I remember thinking about how bizarre that was. But yeah, all right. So 9/11 happens. These issues are to the forefront. Like a lot of good economists, your focus is drawn out the window to trying to explain the world that's there. And you engage in these two books, After War, and then your second book, which was Doing Bad by Doing Good, both of which address this issue or whatever. And it's over a decade that you've been seriously studying these issues. And you have a book with Abby Hall called Tyranny Comes Home, and you examine this boomerang effect. So it relates to what you were just talking about with regard to liberalism and militarism and whatnot. And so perhaps you can explain, because that seems to be a mechanism by which you have an interaction effect that economic sociology is trying to get at. So if you could explain that and relate it both to cost-benefit calculations of individuals, but also the cultural shift in the attitudes that permeate law enforcement establishments in domestic affairs that may be, in fact, even responsible for the situation we're in today.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, the first two books are kind of focused on over there. So after wars, military occupation to export democracy or liberal institutions over there. Doing Bad then is focused on, well, let's say we don't want to export institutions. We just want to create development or provide humanitarian assistance over there. So there's that. Then the third book that you mentioned, Tyranny Comes Home, is focused on the domestic effects of these efforts. And the impetus behind that, again, is it's not that I never thought of these issues, but really what got me thinking about it was Edward Snowden. And so the Snowden revelations happened in 2013, which again, for anyone who's, knows American history, Snowden is not new in what it's new, the specifics are new. But, you go back to the 60s, 70s with the CIA and, all the Pentagon Papers, all this stuff. It's like, and you read the Church Committee report, it's the same kind of stuff, just fancier technology and more covert, because it's hard, the new technology allows the government to remain even more secret now. But in any case, I started just looking up like on Wikipedia, like the NSA. So I'm like, I don't know a lot about the NSA. Like I know it exists. And the NSA in its current iteration was established in 1952 under its current name. But I just started like clicking, Wikipedia, you can keep going back. It says like, if you look at the history of something, it says used to be blah. And so I just started going back before the National Security Agency, and I just kept going back. And I realized, just again, clicking back through Wikipedia, that an organization that was involved in surveilling US citizens, not nearly of the magnitude of the NSA, but very similar in its purpose, and even fewer constraints at the time, existed all the way back into the early 1900s. So I just started reading about that, and that led me to tracing back the origins of this and realizing that the people involved in setting it up had actually been involved in the Philippine-American War in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and then had come back to the United States and tried to set up a similar apparatus using the knowledge that they had gained doing this abroad. At the same time, Abby's first paper that we wrote together was in the summer of her first year in graduate school, is on the militarization of police, where we kind of used the political economy or constitutional political economy type approach to analyze how it was possible for police whose purpose is to protect, so to be part of kind of the protective state, to use Buchanan's language, can actually become the enemy of the people, or some of the people. They can use just the constitutional paradox, right? Any government strong enough to protect people can abuse that power. And so how do we think through, using the tools of constitutional political economy, how that shift might happen? In any case, then Abby and I started, talking about this, and it led to the book. And the idea behind the book, to kind of simplify it down, is that you can't maintain a proactive, aggressive empire, a foreign policy, and not have it affect domestic life. Now, the way it affects domestic life is going to vary greatly. And so that's what we need to explain, of course. We have a general framework, but the specific kind of channels and mechanisms through which it returns home depends on a variety of kind of specific factors. And so in terms of the cost-benefit analysis facing individuals, look, just think of basic economics. We talk all the time about people gaining human capital. We talk about people being alert to profit opportunities. Typically, we talk about that in the context of markets, and I think that's correct. But we also can extend that logic, I think, to other areas. And when people gain human capital in controlling other people, whether that's surveilling them, whether that is, we call them specialists in social control. They basically gain a comparative advantage in controlling other people, whether that's through surveillance, direct force, whatever. When they return from abroad, or when they leave the government from planning out and innovating, because these are innovators. They have to innovate just like anyone else. Someone innovated to come up with new and better ways to surveil people, torture people, murder people, so on. They just don't go away. Some people return to civilian life. It's not like everyone all of a sudden, because we don't have like a bad man theory. It's not like bad people go abroad, do bad stuff, and then come home and do bad stuff. It's that, what are you going to do? Well, think about, and you don't have to look far. Like, look at Stanley McChrystal, right? He had his whole career in the military, very accomplished. What does he do when he leaves the U.S. government? He goes to Alexandria and sets up McChrystal Consulting. And who does he consult with? He consults with people in the military. That's what his comparative advantage is. That's what his network is in. So it's not necessarily kind of a malicious, I want to, maim and murder people. But what type of human capital does someone like that bring? And how are they going to influence policy? Well, if your mindset, if your skills, if the way you think about things is controlling other human beings using this variety of tools, that's how you're going to tend to think about things. Yeah. That's how you're going to tend to think about both the kind of policies that you adopt, the kind of technologies, and I don't mean necessarily like computer technologies, I mean methods and technologies that you adopt, and then the way you implement those things. But then there's even more. One of the things we highlight in the book for kind of, we call them foundational conditions for things to return home is certain conditions domestically. And one of those is fear on the part of the citizenry. And of course, when people are fearful of some threat, they oftentimes turn to government. This is Buchanan's Afraid to Be Free, for instance, among other people have pointed this out as well. But also the extent of the battlefield. When the battlefield includes the homeland, domestic life, then it's much more likely for the weapons of war to spread at the battlefield. And many people would say, yeah, we want weapons on the battlefield. well, okay, what are the two main battlefields over the last several decades? War on terror that we were just talking about, but even before that, the war on drugs. These are two open-ended wars. They literally cover every corner of the earth. If you just think about 9/11, what is one of the things that kind of the mentality after 9/11? Everyone's a suspect. Everyone's a potential terrorist, because it's not like terrorists, wear a uniform. They don't follow the Geneva Conventions. They're not over there. They could be anywhere. It could be you, it could be me, it could be any. Same with drugs. Anyone could be, could be caught up in the war on drugs. And of course, there's numerous stories of people being caught up in this. In addition to people that like to use drugs, they're caught up in it as well.
Yeah,
but in any case, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, see something, say something.
Yeah.
Right? For those of us who were, ever traveled back to New York and were on subways, that was like the big sign, right? See something, say something. Yeah.
Yep. And that's part of it. That's part of the propaganda story too. We'll come to that later. But yeah, so anyway, you get this influx of equipment. Again, you don't need, I want to make clear, this isn't a classical liberal or libertarian argument. It's pure economics, because think about it. You have a war at home, the war on drugs. We have something called the economics of prohibition. You make something illegal, we know all the stuff, pushes it underground, raises the price, attracts high time preference people. Those high time preference people can't rely on formal mechanisms. They can't go to the courts. They can't call the police. So what do? They get big guns, right? They get big guns to fight the other cartels and to combat the police. Well, the police now have like a bobby stick or a 6-shooter, right? And they say, well, these guys have AK-47s over here. We need AK-47s too, right? And so one response would be to remove prohibition. That would get rid of many of those nefarious effects that I just mentioned. Another is to then ramp up arming the police, which is what the government started doing in the 80s. They started saying, look, and this is all part of the conservative movement, actually, and part of it, of course, is we want to reduce government waste. And so one way of doing that was they said, look, we have this surplus military equipment that's just sitting here. It's going to be wasted. We shouldn't waste taxpayer dollars. We shouldn't just let this equipment go to waste. We have the war on drugs. Let's transfer it to police departments. So anyway, what Abby and I argue in the broadest sense is that, when you have a proactive foreign policy, it's going to have real effects on the social fabric of domestic life. And it's going to empower government. It is going to change the mentality of government. And it's also, in many cases, going to change the mentality of people with their relationship with government. And I'll just touch upon one thing and then we can move on, since given the context of economics and sociology. Again, in some sense, these ideas are not new to us. Tocqueville in Democracy in America makes this wonderful point where he says, I'm paraphrasing, this isn't a direct quote, but he says, look, war is the greatest threat to democracy. And it's not the greatest threat because of what he calls hard despotism. So it's not like you're going to go to war and all of a sudden you're going to get an authoritarian despot take over tomorrow. That's kind of like the way people mock civil libertarians often. They say, you think that, a terrible, person's going to rise tomorrow. They'll make fun of Hayek with the road to serfdom, the kind of straw man version of the road to serfdom, the slippery slope. You think if there's a price control on milk, we're going to get a dictator tomorrow. That's not the argument. Again, it's a nuanced argument. The issue is what Tocqueville calls soft despotism. It's the equivalent of like a frog slowly burning in water, right? And not realizing the temperatures. And the way he puts it is, all of these rules slowly emerge up. You don't even realize they're emerging. The relationship between the citizen and the state slowly changes. And before you know it, there is more despotism, more control, more political power, if you want to call it that trumps social power. Social power being our ability as individuals to come together in groups. Again, you can see the connection with economic sociology, to come up with solutions to the array of collective action problems that define daily life. And what does that do? Well, that leads to a whole host of issues. It makes us kind of lose that habit of solving problems on our own, or it's like not exercising. You lose it if you don't practice it. It also expands the scope of government power over our lives. That becomes normalized, so that you and I still think it's odd that we have to take our shoes off when we go to the airport, or put our little bag of 3-ounce whatever. I know they make that up because they changed it with COVID. But my kids don't think that's weird. To them, that stuff is a normal way of life. And so that's the Tocqueville point. And so really these are issues in constitutional political economy, but more broadly, like what is at the foundation of a free society? And what is at the foundation of maintaining that free society when it exists, which, as Tocqueville points out, is quite rare in the history of mankind. And so from that standpoint, these issues are foundational.
Yeah, I also think that your work highlights a very basic and elementary principle, again, about the what is seen and what is unseen. And so much of this conversation that takes place talks about these actions, but never considers the unseen consequences down the road. And so I think you're highlighting a lot of that what is unseen to people so that they could better calculate the consequences and the benefits and costs associated. So going back, it's not a libertarian position, it's an economic position about looking at these unintended consequences for the society. So there is a literature in your field on the permanent war economy as well as the military-industrial complex. And I was wondering how you see yourself fit into that literature, because it's oftentimes a literature dominated by writers from a different perspective than what you bring to bear. So what is it that you're learning from that literature, and what is it that you're bringing to that literature that you hope improves it and enriches it?
Yep, that's a great question. And so when you say from a different perspective, it's Marxist usually.
Yeah,
Marxist. It's so, and I don't use that as to deride anyone. That's what the perspective it comes from. The idea being that a capitalist system is limited in its ability to exploit a group of laborers in a fixed geographic area to profit from the riches of the land and labor. And so the argument is that once capitalists have, if you think of kind of a typical kind of tragedy of the common situation where you overgraze a field, it's kind of a similar logic, not exactly, but very similar, where for a geographic area, the capitalists are going to exploit all the riches. And when that happens, they are going to want more riches because they're greedy. So where are they and other capitalists going to go? Well, they're going to start looking abroad. And so from this perspective, the nature of war and the war economy being all of the stuff that goes into the production of war making, is going to naturally lead to imperialism abroad. Because the imperialism is driven by capitalism, by creating new markets, by exploiting workers abroad, and so on. Of course, this was Lenin's argument as well. But again, he didn't come up with it. He got it from other people that had made it prior to him. And some people still hold this position. So in terms of how I relate, I think the folks who make those arguments make some good arguments. One of the arguments they make that I think is good, or one that we need to wrestle with, those of us that are fans of markets, that are fans, people, I'm not going to name names, but people that are fans of the minimal state, the night watchman state. So if you say, well, a lot of people, even classical liberals, say we need the state, but we need it for defense, courts, and police. Okay, let's grant that for the sake of discussion. Adam Smith, Buchanan's productive state, Milton Friedman, Hayek, Mises, all these folks, many others. The argument is, where are you going to get the stuff to do that, to create and sustain the protective state? And one of the things I've tried to point out is that these thinkers, going all the way back to Adam Smith, kind of pull a fast one, because they say limited government, they list a very limited number of functions, and it sounds like, oh yeah, just defense, police, courts. Well, start unpacking all the stuff involved in all those things. Like, pick something. We just talked about the militarization of police. Try unpacking that, and you'll realize quickly how complex this is. Now try to unpack all the mundane things, and then the actual kind of more extreme things, like the actual killing of people, abuses of power, and so on. You realize that what falls under the purview of limited, from this perspective, again, defined by number of functions, is actually extremely unlimited. Yeah. On top of that, when you start thinking about what is required to produce all this stuff, you realize that it's what Don Lavoie called non-comprehensive planning. It's actually the best example of that. It is government planners saying we're going to extract resources from taxpayers, direct those resources to producing stuff, defense, police, courts, and so on, and then we're going to do that in the name of the national interest, okay? think about all the problems just with that. Now, if anyone said that for anything else, if we said, forget about defense, let's pick a much more localized and kind of ordinary example. If we said, government is going to provide the optimal amount of education or postal service or the optimal level of DMV-ness, whatever that is, we'd laugh, right? We'd say that's ridiculous. There's bureaucratic issues, there's knowledge problems, there's incentive issues, and we'd go through all our normal stuff. But when it comes to these other things, if you lay forth the position I just made, oftentimes that's ridiculed. They'll say, well, that's ridiculous. Who's going to provide the roads version of defense? Who's going to provide defense? And economists as a field, and social scientists, political scientists, many political scientists are complicit in this, because what they do is they'll say, defense is a public good. It needs to be provided by the state. Let's move on. But then defense is treated like it's this black box that just falls from on high. But again, economics tells us not to. And again, this is not a ideological argument. Think about Elinor Ostrom. What was Elinor Ostrom's, well, she had numerous points, but what was one of her key points? That social scientists treat models as, she refers to as a straitjacket. And she's talking about the tragedy of the commons, of course. And her view is that, look, the tragedy of the commons model says people can't solve the problem. Social scientists say they can't solve the problem, end of the day. But then Ostrom looks out the window, sees people solving, and say, well, wait, either people are crazy or the social scientists are crazy, or they're missing something. That's the more charitable way to put it. And so what I've tried to push people on is applying the same logic to defense. So again, what I take from the Marxist kind of critique is that it is true that capitalists, private entities, can utilize the political apparatus to engage in imperialism abroad for their own purposes, just like an interest group domestically can utilize the political apparatus for their own gain. So it's just a simple extension of that. But what does that mean? To my way of thinking, that is not inherent critique of capitalism, but rather an inherent critique of the political apparatus, because it is the political apparatus which, acting in the name of the public interest, the national interest, which enables those people to do that, to engage in unproductive entrepreneurship. So then the question becomes, can you empower the state and constrain the state? Yeah. I personally don't think you can. Lots of other people think you can, and it's necessary. And then that leads into all these other discussions about, about empire and liberal empire and all that. But in terms of the economy, I'm also a big fan, as you know, of this. He's an engineer, actually. His name's Seymour Melman. He taught at Columbia. He wasn't an economist. And again, he was coming from a more left-leaning perspective on these issues. But one of the things I really like about his work is he talks about how military spending has distortionary effects on economic activity. And I really like that point. And in some of the stuff I've tried to write with Tom Duncan, a former student here, we've tried to pick up on this from an Austrian perspective. So what happens to the market process when you inject government intervention in the form of the military sector into that? What happens, for instance, when Google shifts its focus from satiating the wants of you and I as consumers to satiating the wants of people in the Pentagon to create artificial intelligence? Something clearly happens. We have a theory of interventionism. We have a theory of productive and unproductive entrepreneurship. And so how would that look, and how would you spell that out? And there's a lot more to be done on that, but that's kind of the overarching gist of it.
We also have a simple theory of derived demand and imputation. So whoever the final consumer is going to determine the value of what higher order goods are going to be allocated in which way, including human capital allocations. So you're doing really, really important work there about the embedded nature of the economy within this polity and the demands that the polity puts on the economy. So I have two more questions that I want to ask you, and one of them may be a little goofy, but it's basically as follows, which is that you've chosen for your career to really focus on questions of an urgent nature that are in many cases pessimistic, meaning you're dealing with the deaths of thousands of people as a consequence of the policy errors that you've identified, the destruction of people's lives because of the policies that have been pursued in, like, say, When Tyranny Comes Home, and people have their liberty stripped from them, even though maybe they shouldn't have deserved to have their stripped from them, but because of the way that this goes on. So it would not probably be, wrong to think that you're like a kind of a dour guy, but you're really not, right? And so you work on these kind of very urgent and pessimistic things, but yet what do you take away, or what is your most optimistic lesson that you can take away from your various studies of these various depressing outcomes?
Yeah, so you raise an interesting point about the pessimism, and I can see that. And, it's interesting, people have commented, and I'm sure this is true. It's always hard to stand outside yourself and look in, that I've gotten increasingly angry over time from after war and doing bad to as I've matured, I guess, or maybe become more mature, depending who you ask. But yeah, look, I think a lot of these things can be pessimistic and make you angry, but I am an optimist at the end. And here's why. What motivates me, again, is something that, again, there's numerous insights with Buchanan. Every time we read him for our Adam Smith Fellowship or for our reading groups, or we teach him, I always pick up new things, any of these kind of big systematic thinkers. But one of the things I really appreciate from Buchanan is you can never avoid normative issues, because you always have to have some normative theory of what the state, if we're talking about the state, ought to do and what its goals should be. You can't avoid that. We can pretend, we can be like, no, I'm scientific. But we talk about then how the state needs to fix market failures. Well, there's normative assumptions embedded at multiple levels there. And so let's be clear about that, and let's think about that. So we want a free society, a society where people can be free, not dominated by others, where there are protections in place for minority groups. I don't mean minority based on, skin color, gender, religion. I mean minority, whoever the group that wouldn't win a majority vote on whatever topic we're talking about, irregardless of their personal characteristics, and so on. That's my normative goal, and I think people can achieve that under certain conditions. I also think, which again is the straw man attack that is often made against myself in some cases, but others that question these things. It's not that I don't think that there are real threats in the world, that I don't think defense against those threats are real. My issue is that by empowering the state to do these things, you are creating threats. So there's different margins of threats. There are external threats in the world, so you give government power. But again, going back to the paradox of government, you've just created a new threat. Again, the magic trick people play is that, no, they're constrained, they won't hurt you. But why? Why do we assume that? That's something that needs to be demonstrated rather than assumed, at least to my way of thinking. Okay, so we have what is the nature of the state? Well, Weber tells us it's the monopoly on force in a geographic space. Again, that force can be used for good, and it can be used for terrible things. If you think I'm overstating, go read R.J. Rummel's book on government in the 20th century. And governments, according to his calculations, slaughtered numerous more people, their own people, what he calls democide, as compared to what died during international wars, which again is a large number, but it's truly staggering. And so you'll quickly realize the destructive nature or potential of the state. So then the question becomes, what alternatives do we have? Well, there's numerous, but here's one. How about people figure out alternative ways of providing security that don't require the state? And you say, well, that's crazy. It's a public good. Well, again, it doesn't have to be a public good. Public good is a very specific meaning. A Samuelsonian public good is a very specific meaning in economics. And if you look at what constitutes defense in practice, very little of it actually satisfies those conditions. Very little of it.
And that's a essential public good. So that tells you how difficult the theory is, actually.
Yep, exactly. But then you bring in the Ostrom point, Eleanor Ostrom, about people being able to figure things out under certain circumstances. It's not a panacea, it's not a guarantee, but we also can't push it off the table. So here's the way to think about it. What is less scientific? Saying, you're silly because you're saying the state shouldn't provide defense, or defense is a real issue, but maybe people can figure out ways to provide it because the nature of the security threat is context specific, unique, and changes as conditions change. The nature of the threat, technologies, people's ingenuity and creativity, and they come up with new things and so on. So where does this all lead me in concrete terms to think about? and this is my reason for potential optimism. There's an entire literature, and this is highly relevant for today in the United States, forget about, international relations, on what's called nonviolent action. And, this literature has existed for a long time, but kind of the preeminent theorist in our lifetime was a political scientist named Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp, I believe he got his PhD at Oxford. Actually, his master's was in sociology, where he first started writing about nonviolent action. He went abroad, got his PhD, came back. Schelling invited him to Harvard. And that's where he finished up his main book, which was published in 1973. It's called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. It's 3 volumes. Schelling wrote the introduction, actually. And Thomas Schelling, of course, in addition to being a Nobel Prize winner, is one of kind of the founders of conflict economics, along with Kenneth Boulding and several others. But in any case, Sharp asks or explores or analyzes the ability of people to come together and in a collective action situation, he doesn't use that language, but that's what he's analyzing, to push back or to protect themselves against both internal and external threats. And he talks about the theory, but also the applications. And so this is a fascinating set of stuff to look at, because he has all these case studies of people who engaged in many cases, what are considered very mundane activities. So it doesn't have to, again, we think about defense like tanks rolling through the streets or nukes, but it could be something like, he talked about occupiers coming to a country and the teachers not going to teach the students. And then the students don't have teachers, they're at home, they annoy their parents, and their parents get angry, and then they start agitating. And then that, or you work in a factory, but you don't not show up for work, you just slow down, and then stuff doesn't get produced, and then people get angry. There's other things too he talks about, peaceful protests and so on. And what he shows is that not in all, in many instances, nonviolent action can be extremely effective in allowing people to protect themselves and their fellow nonviolent actors against both internal and external threats. This is not some naive pacifism. It's not like Sharp's just saying, like, stand there and take it. It is a strategic set of actions, because Sharp says 2 things, and I think they're fascinating. Number one, all governments, even the most oppressive authoritarian governments, ultimately derive their power from the people. That is, if enough people do not comport with the dictates of government, the government can't operate unless they literally slaughter everyone.
Right.
So all governments depend on enough citizens acquiescing. Again, this is a point that Havel, of course, raised in his book, The Power of the Powerless, right? This is his greengrocer with the sign in the window, and what happens if the greengrocer doesn't put his sign up? That's the power of what appears to be powerless actually have a lot of power. So that's one. The second is that there's no way for most citizens to compete with the state in terms of violence. If you take Weber's definition, again, that the state is a monopoly on violence, you and I can't compete with that. Ordinary people that come together can't compete with that. So we can either just lay down and take it, or we can figure out ways around this. And one of the ways is to remove our consent and to engage in nonviolent action. And then he goes through all these different mechanisms. So volume 1 of that 3-volume book is laying out this theory. Volume 2 is the different methods of nonviolent action. I think he identifies like 198 different methods. And again, a lot of these things appear to be mundane to like having a sit-in. Well, that can be a big thing in certain instances. Again, look back not too far in US history during the civil rights movement and so on. You can see the role of those things. He also talks about what he calls political jujitsu. And that is using the violence of the regime against them. And so one of the things he points out, and again, this is the discipline and leadership that is required, and coordination. It's a collective action problem. So you need, again, he doesn't use this term, but you need things that economists would call selective incentives. Tullock talks about this in The Paradox of Revolution, of course, and others have talked about this since. So in any case, the regime is typically going to meet nonviolent action with repression. They're going to beat you, shoot you, and so on. If you can use that against them, you can actually undermine their legitimacy. One way of doing that is to make clear to both other citizens and people outside, especially with innovations in media and technology, the true nature of the regime. And so when you see an innocent person, I mean, think about, again, Tiananmen Square with the tank and the person. What's the power of that? There's an ordinary individual with the little bag or whatever, and there's a tank in front of them. Yeah. The ordinary person versus the state, the Goliath, right? So they're beating you with their masks on and their armor. And everyone else sees the curtain has been pulled back on the nature of the state. That's not a guarantee it's going to be toppled, but it is a way, Sharp points out, for people to leverage the violence of the state against them in certain circumstances. In any case, I'm fascinated by this because I think it is a very powerful and effective way historically to provide security. It's overlooked because it's small scale. So again, there's this weird tendency among people to forget about methodological individualism and talk about the nation when it comes to security and defense. But why? Yeah. If you look historically, it's small groups of people coming together. So you take insights from Sharp, you take insights from economic sociology, you take insights from the Ostroms on polycentricity, and you take insights from the stuff that you've done with Dragos Alagica and Vlad Tarko on public administration. And say, well, how do you internalize those externalities? We can rely on the state to do that, but we don't have to. People can come up with solutions. Now, the pushback, and I know I'm going long here, but it's all right, and I'll stop after this, is that some externalities are so big that they can't be internalized, so we need the state. My response to that is to say, well, wait a second, okay, but then where does the state come from? If people are incapable of providing defense because the externality is large, which it might be, that's conceptually possible, then how are you going to create a state apparatus that is even larger? Because it's not just going to do defense. It's going to do lots of other things. And it's not just going to do defense against one threat. It's going to defend us against all threats. Yeah. And so how can that be both designed and then checked? If citizens are incapable of coming together to provide security in the first place, how can they come together to check government? And then you've unleashed Leviathan. The game's over at that point because you've basically given up, you've empowered government, but you don't have the constraints. And so that's kind of the constitutional political economy dilemma we need to think about.
Yeah. I also think there's a tremendous research opportunity that you lay out there in following up on Sharp's stuff. So take the 3 volumes and especially the second volume and look at the various different examples, update them to today, look at the experiences around. You can do the intersection between economics, politics, and society by just looking right at that kind of motion and power of nonviolence. I mean, I guess James Scott, in some sense, is another person that's thought about these issues, but it should be people like, some of our graduate students could get serious in history or in actual field work by studying these kind of movements today and their success and whatnot in pulling off change.
One of the main people on this now, she's a political scientist. She just moved to Harvard. She was at one of the schools in Denver, I think University of Denver. Erica Chenoweth's her name. And she put together this data set of nonviolent movements. And she found that nonviolent movements were more successful than violent movements in their data set to achieve their ends. And their argument is that you can actually get more people on board because it doesn't require people to engage in violence. And really it's a comparative advantage argument. Like not many people have if I wouldn't be very good at like running out in the street and fighting government soldiers. But if they're saying to me, like, you don't have to teach or something like that, it's much easier for me to do. In any case, there is a fascinating set of research to be done on this, I think, and you're exactly right. And look, in today's world, if you just look out the window now, forget about security and defense, and you look at what's happening in the United States, where there's kind of this underlying debate about how do you get social change? And then, what kind of, do you rely on violence? Does violence work? Or are there other means of doing it? You can see how these questions are extremely relevant today.
Yeah, I think that, the image that comes to my mind, which might not be actually accurate, but besides Havel, it would be Gandhi and the idea of making sure that people understand the brutality of the British imperialists and colonialists by making them stare at that brutality in their face. And I think when we see in the United States, our local police engage in an activity where they view their citizens as enemy combatants, that really sort of, puts it on the forefront to us about what's going on. Whereas I think when you get violence meeting other violence, it gets confused. Not saying it's not always recommended, but if you look at like 1989, again, starting with Tiananmen Square, the violence that was thrust upon those protesters has, stain that image of that idea, as opposed to the free mobility of individuals to escape from the borders or go and tear down the Berlin Wall or whatever. That's a different kind of imagery of that. And I think we need to study this more. So I have one question which you've touched on already, and then I want to ask you a bonus question, but just very briefly about the defense brain. In your presidential address at the Southerns for the Society for Development of Austrian Economics, you refer to lobotomizing the defense brain. I think it's just fantastic. And you've talked already a little bit about this, but maybe as a conceptual and analytical point, stressing why it's so important for the lobotomy to improve our critical understanding in political economy and then of economics proper.
Yep. And so, really that idea comes from Buchanan. I mean, Buchanan's 1949 paper, The Pure Theory of Public Finance, a suggested approach is the subtitle. And we read this paper all the time in our Adam Smith Fellowship. That's actually what inspired it. That one of the reasons I like that fellowship program is we interact with students outside GMU. And so you and I get to kind of see what other people, how they respond to these things. They're interdisciplinary. So that was kind of one of our foundational papers. So like our third or fourth time doing this, I remember sitting there, I'm like, Buchanan's point is in some sense, very simple. But again, I'm biased towards understanding it. So I don't think it's simple for other people. I don't think they've internalized it. And to distill down a more nuanced point, he says, look, there's two ways we can approach public finance. We can talk about what he calls a fiscal brain, and says it's like a supercomputer. And that computer has access to a social welfare function. They extract optimal amount of resources, spit them through, and then spit out optimal outputs, and you maximize social welfare. An alternative view is to, what he calls the individualistic view, is to unpack political decision-making, what we would call public choice and constitutional political economy, and say, instead of simply assuming that, number one, they have the knowledge of the social welfare function, and number two, the incentives, so they have to know what the optimal amount of resources is to extract, then you got to put them through the political process. Marginal decisions need to be made. You need to take into account opportunity costs, so that you get into Buchanan's cost and choice and the subjective nature of cost. Then you need to produce goods and services and decide who's going to get them, so you have the allocation problem. You start unpacking all that, you realize, number one, it's really complex. Number two, it overlaps with the Mises-Hayek-Lavoie discussion of comprehensive and non-comprehensive planning, as well as the insights of public choice. Okay, so as I was, in that when I had that aha moment during the Smith sitting, it was like, well, what's one area where economists are guilty of this? Defense. Again, it's defense is a public good, the state must provide it. That's the defense brain. The defense brain is the government. We pretend that people can't provide defense because it's a public good. So the theory says it will be severely undersupplied. So the state needs to do it. Well, what are the implicit presuppositions? What are the assumptions that are made? Government is going to tax people the right amount, go through the political process, produce defense, the right amount in the quantity and quality, and then spit out protection in order to maximize the public interest. Again, you don't need to have a PhD or rocket science, be a rocket scientist. Go look at any of kind of the Inspector General reports in Afghanistan and Iraq and ask yourself, is the government using your resources wisely? Just go look at the war on drugs in Afghanistan, all right? And just look at that one slice and say, is this government defending me? Are they providing me security? And very quickly you realize, no, very little they do provide security, and very little they do is using resources wisely. So anyway, it was my effort to unpack that. The lobotomy, of course, is meant to kind of end the delusions of the patient. That's the idea behind it. And so my goal there was to end, in that title, was to end the delusions of economists, that they could just model the state provision of defense as kind of this optimal, very smooth process that maximize social welfare, which is what they oftentimes model it as.
So when I just gave the introduction to the new students in the program, and I was talking about basically Hayek, Buchanan, and the Ostroms, and I used the metaphor of turning a prism and getting different shades of colors, and all of a sudden the world is different. And my argument is that, if you look at, like, say, Buchanan, he's a public finance economist, so he's just like everyone else. But what he did was he just twisted it slightly, and then it showed all these other color ranges that previously the Samuelsonian public finance economists or Musgrave never would have gotten.
Exactly.
In this case, it forces us to think about, as you pointed out, the rational choices of the individuals that are in the political process, and to view politics itself as an exchange process that is going on. It's not from on high, or I love the way you just put it, which is that you plug it into a machine and the machine spits out the optimal solution. That's not how politics operates. So, I mean, and you've done a fantastic job of exploring this in your work and exploring the implications of it and everything like that. And so you have written a lot of different papers. And so I hope people follow up on that. So one last question, which is the bonus round, right? I won't ask you underrated, overrated. We'll just, I would like to know what your, what you think gets you most excited about your current work that you're doing, and what questions in that work do you think need most answering to make sense of the world that we live in?
Sure. And so I'll be brief because I realize I was long in some of the answers. So Abby and I have another book coming out on propaganda. It's called Manufacturing Militarism. We're playing off Chomsky, of course, with manufacturing consent. And in there, we are looking at how we focus on the war on terror. So propaganda during the war on terror, U.S. government propaganda. And, again, we draw on many of the insights from Buchanan and others. And talk about, kind of the theoretical framework is, well, what happens when you centralize control of power? That's the national security state. You centralize control of information because you have massive classification, what many people refer to as overclassification of information. So even, many members of Congress and congressional oversight, certainly citizens can't get access to this in the name of national security. Of course, the incentive is to overclassify in order to insulate yourself from oversight. So what happens? Well, you have massive information asymmetries, and that allows government actors to manipulate that information in the pursuit of their own ends. That's just the incentives of politics. That creates problems, though, for a self-governing liberal democratic society and the ability of people to check government actors to ensure that they're actually doing things in the public interest and so on. So we have the theoretical framework, and then we talk about a whole host of things. You brought up earlier the see something, say something, and the idea of creating a world of eyes looking at everyone else. I have to be suspect of you. And the U.S. government invested significant. I don't know how much you read about this, but they invested millions of dollars in these efforts to look at people in airports and like, are you blinking too much, or are you sweating, or it's like, yeah, I'm sweating. I just ran through the airport because I was late. Does that make me a terrorist, or am I just a sweaty person because I just ran through the airport? So you can see the issues here. It's kind of like the mind reading back in the during the Cold War, when the U.S. government pretended they could read people's minds. That's the men with goats or whatever. Right. But in any case, which is true, by the way. But so anyway, we have that. I have another book I just finished up, which it's still, finding where it's going to be published, called Against Empire, that kind of brings together a lot of the stuff you and I have been talking about in my writings on this. And one of the things I've tried to push back on is that there's a lot of people don't agree with the things I've said to you and that I've written, especially even people that are sympathetic on other margins. So a lot of people would be sympathetic with things that I've said about markets, for instance, or entrepreneurship. Classical liberals broadly understood. Right. But of course, many of them are also very pro-empire, and they believe it's a force for good. The idea of liberal empire. This is like Deepak Lal, Neil Ferguson, and so on. And they have arguments. It's not like they're just saying things. And so anyway, I'm trying to counter that. And the other thing I'm really excited about is something you and I touched on earlier, is this polycentric defense topic, which I'm currently working on. And we have an initial paper, but I'm trying to expand it, doing very much along the lines of what you were talking about, with updating some of these case studies, illustrating the relevance for today. And I think that's important for offering people, at a minimum, an existence proof of the ability of people to engage in what Sharp called civilian-based defense. Yeah. The idea that people can come together and provide solutions to real security challenges that they face. And so that's the other thing I'm really excited about, because I think that's the biggest challenge, right? People are always going to say, well, what would we do in the absence of government doing this? And so I think that's a very powerful thing to point out. You mentioned Lynn earlier, and let me just give you, Lynn Ostrom, let me give you another motivating thing like you got from Buchanan and the defense brain.
So there's a line in the Governing the Commons. She says that, I think it's in the Governing Commons, but that Olson's book should have been titled The Logic of Collective Inaction.
Yep, that's right.
Because his theory shows that the groups can't get together to achieve the action. And I think there could be a logic of, basically following the Sharp model, because in the same way, it's a similar kind of thing. Eleanor describes herself at times as a biologist who's going around and seeing these species that everyone else tells her are extinct, but then she sees them. They look like them, they sound like them, they behave like them, but they're supposed to be extinct, but they actually exist. And similar kind of thing about, self-defense or civil nonviolent defense mechanisms and their effectiveness. And I think that might be a kind of a rallying point around it, the logic of, again, just like the defense brain, that people claim that you can't have these kind of defense mechanisms unless you have a state, but yet we see it all the time that you can. And they make a bigger appeal for themselves the more we pay attention to what is unseen in the argument for the state. Because, that goes back to your point about the, people who are classical liberal, but also, what is called the strong minimal state, right?
Yep.
A classical liberal, but strong minimal state. Well, part of that is because they think that having the strong minimal state doesn't affect the minimalness or the freedom within that. So anyway, I think that's great work that you're doing and all of that. And especially I'm looking forward to the propaganda stuff, because I'm sure you have a chapter, must be looking at the impact of the military on sports,
movies, Hollywood. So Transformers is in there, among others. And Iraq, of course, both the initial invasion of Iraq and after, and several other case studies. So, the propaganda doesn't look like it did in World War II, where you had posters on every corner, but it's still all around us. In many cases, it's more kind of covert. I also end up where we end the book. It's the last chapter is based on, again, playing off Havel's, called The Power of the Propagandized, which is people have the power. And this is where kind of the greengrocer comes in, right? His example that they can remove the propaganda poster from the window and pull back the curtain of the regime. And so it's people power. Again, it's all based on people power, which is Tocquevillian, Ostrom, all that kind of stuff, Buchanan.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. This is outstanding, and I really appreciate you taking the time to spend that with me and explain your work for others. And I hope that they, pick up on that and are able to run with it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.